Hi everyone, and welcome back to our next session on YouTube. So I am going to look today at Unit 5, which is the Introductory Awareness of Equality and Inclusion in Health, Social Care, Children and Young People settings. So this should be starting on page, what are we on, 47 in your work booklets there. So please get out your work booklet onto Unit 5, which is page 47, and it should look like this. Okay. So the first question on Unit 5 asks you to create a poster. Okay, so again, on your Unit 5, you have a page set out where you can put your poster here. There's no need to add additional sheets if you don't wish to. You can, of course, but there is no need at this stage. So it says define the terms equality and inclusion. So you need to look at a definition of equality and a definition of inclusion. So what it's asking for is a poster that is showing that you understand what those two terms mean. So when we think about equality, we did look at this in Unit 2, but obviously that was a couple of weeks ago and there's been quite a bit going on in the country since then. So equality means treating people fairly. Okay, so if I try and do this, I don't know how well this will come up. So from my screen here, you can see the slide that I want you to work with. So what does equality mean? Equality means treating people fairly and to make reasonable adjustments so they get equal opportunities. Now that phrase there, reasonable adjustments, that phrase there comes from the Equality Act of 2010, okay? So people being treated fairly regardless of their differences. And we can see here in this tree, it's going to go a little bit fuzzy, but we've got race, gender, religion, beliefs, gender reassignment, age, maternity, disability, marriage or civil partnership. And if you remember back to that session, we had a look at this picture as well, where although this family on this first picture are being treated equally because they've all been given the same box to work with, so they've been treated equally, it's not fair on them. So to be treated fairly, they need to be giving one box up to give to the smaller child there. And just at the bottom of there, equality means the state of being equal regardless of race, age, gender, disability, sexual orientation, gender reassignment. Okay, so back to me over here. Okay, so equality, like we said, is about looking at the differences that people have, and those differences are stated in the Equality Act of 2010. The Equality Act says that we must make reasonable adjustments to give people fair opportunities, because being equal doesn't mean treating everybody the same. Okay. On to the next part, so inclusion. What does inclusion mean? Okay, so in education you will hear lots and lots about inclusion. If you look at any schools' policies online, you will see that they have an inclusion policy. Now those inclusion policies are there so that all children are included. Okay, so on the slide there I've put inclusion is a sense of belonging that involves feeling respected and valued for who you are as an individual or group. So again, it's looking at it from a perspective of the differences that we have. So just because somebody has a different skin colour to another group of people, it doesn't mean that they are not able to be included. Just because somebody uses a wheelchair, it doesn't mean again that they are not able to be included. We can look at that in terms of, like, you know, places to go. So if we take, for example, a zoo, because I went to a zoo the other week, I think I told some of you about that. Although Chester Zoo is very much like an outdoorsy place, it caters for people with wheelchairs and pushchairs really, really well. There's ramps everywhere. There's only a couple of bits that they can't go into just for different sort of health and safety reasons, but the majority of it, they are included in being able to go in there. So inclusion is important. It promotes a culture of equality. So it helps us to make equality happen, if that makes sense. Okay. So in order to make society more equal, we have to be able to include everybody in there. Inclusion is not just in education, it's not just in sort of, you know, places like my example of Chester Zoo. It is everywhere. So it's about being included in a wider society as well as your smaller communities. So if you think about your smaller communities, sort of before the early 1990s, there were still homes for people to live in that were sort of more institutional, where people with a variation of different disabilities, learning difficulties, mental health problems were placed to live in a house together, where they were not treated very nicely for the most part either. A very sort of historic view of disability was to keep people all sort of away in one place, whereas nowadays, you know, you could have people living in a community with you. You see older people still living in their homes even when they've got, you know, be it a physical disability or be it something like dementia, they're able to stay in their own homes. You see children living in houses down the street to you, where they may have to get transport to school because they use a wheelchair. It's still very sort of normal to have people in our communities now, whereas prior to this time it wasn't normal. So I think that's quite a great step that we've taken there. So what you'll need to do is you need to create a poster that shows both of these terms. So once again, I've got an example for you here. So if I just show you this one. So all we've got is equality on one side and inclusion on the other. And just quite simply, what those two terms mean. So this girl here, she's gone sort of a bit more in depth. If you just want to put sort of, you know, a definition from a dictionary, yeah, you can do that as well. But it's about showing your understanding for it. So making sure that you are getting across what equality means and what inclusion means. So you are defining it, and definitions obviously come from places like dictionaries and from the information that I've told you there. Okay, so if you create that poster for me, like I say, you can use the page that you've been provided on page 49 there. And if you're ready at that point, you can pause this video now. Okay, so we should be ready to go on to page 51 on question 29. Now what you'll see is question 29 actually goes over 2 pages. So you'll go on to page 53 as well. So you've got 4 boxes to fill in. Now these boxes relate to different principles and values. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss each value one by one and give you a moment to pause there to write your answer in. So when we're thinking about the promotion of rights, the question says, outline how equality and inclusion form the basis for the principles and values of health, social care, children's and young people's settings. Now what that question is asking you is to show your understanding of equality and inclusion and how that brings in the values and principles that we're going to discuss in order. So equality and inclusion always form the basis of these principles and values that we work with in health and social care, in childcare and in young people's settings. So the first one says promotion of rights. Okay, so when you joined the course here, you were able to tell us, if you wish to, any disabilities or learning difficulties or other differences that you may have had. Now, the reason that we have that on the application form is so that we can cater to your needs. We don't want somebody to feel that they are not able to access the information that we're providing because it might be too small font, it might be a colour where white paper is not always readable by some people. So it's so important that we know that some of the differences that you could have had or do have, so that we can cater for your learning needs. Okay. Promotion of rights also means that you're able to learn in a classroom together with other people of different genders, different races, beliefs, religion, pregnancy, etc. Because equality and inclusion form the basis of the rights principle by giving people the right to tell the nursery, tell the school, tell the social workers for the young people or the youth workers, tell the carers and the managers of those care settings. They can tell them about themselves, so they can tell them their differences. Maybe they've got a learning difficulty, maybe they've got a physical disability, maybe they've got a strong dislike to being in rooms of more than 5 people. It's all of these things that are going to help people to be given that equal opportunity to feel included as well, to be able to be included as well. So when you're writing this answer out, the first principle and value, promotion of rights, you could start it with equality and inclusion form the basis for the principles and values in nursery settings, as the children are provided with the same rights to tell the nursery staff about differences they may have, such as, and then give me some examples. Okay, so you can pause this now so you can write that down. Promotion of choice is another principle and value that stems from the equality and inclusion principles that we looked at before. So when we're thinking about choices, we all have choices in life, and it's up to us to be able to make those choices for ourselves. Now, in terms of children's care, children may not make the best choices for themselves. However, we need to listen to the choices of their parents. So, an example of not the best choices could be, what would you like to eat for your lunch? Oh, I'll have chocolate and crisps. Yeah. Although we need to promote the choice there for those children, we need to also promote healthy eating. So we need to think about parents when we're thinking about very young children who are going to make those sort of choices. So children have the choice to lots of differences. So they have the choice of sort of what to wear, or their parents have the choice of what they would like their child to wear, to eat, their routine. So many children will come to a nursery, they'll already be sort of set into a routine, and yes, that routine could need a bit of adapting to make it fit within the nursery sort of routine itself. But ultimately, when we're thinking about choice, no setting can treat every single person or every single child the same. If they are treating every child the same, this is classed as institutional abuse. So it is so important that they are treated with fairness and the same opportunity to have a voice. Okay, so if you go to your principle and value number 2 on page 51, so I'm just going to help you to start that out. So we could start it with equality and inclusion form the basis for the promotion of choice, principle and value, because we all have a voice and we should all be able to voice our choices regardless of differences we may have. Choices in children's care could be, and then give me some examples there. Okay, so you can pause this video at this point so you can answer that question. So the next principle and value is taking into account wishes, needs, likes and dislikes, and this principle and value is on page 53. So you'll see it's at the top of there, taking into account wishes, needs, likes and dislikes. Okay, so when we are taking into account somebody's likes, dislikes, needs and wishes, okay, when we think about a need, it's something they physically need, so something that that is going to help them with their life. So for children, it could be potty training, nappy changes, eating, drinking, those types of things. Whereas wishes, likes and dislikes are more preferences. So it's, again, it goes back to those choices. You'll feel that these cross over a little bit because they all intertwine together. So it is just important that we do look at these as well. So like I say, wishes, likes and dislikes are preferences. Needs are something people need to live. Okay. Working in a nursery setting, you'll be given a care plan for that child. It'll be lots and lots of parent input about what that child's needs are. Where are they up to developmentally? What do they need help with still? What's their favourite foods? What do they not like to eat? What do they like to eat? Do they still have a nap during the day? There's lots of questions that need answering about that child's preferences, routines, needs, etc. So to enable you to give the best care possible to those children or to adults, if you are working in an adult setting, you'll also have a life story about that person and their preferences and their needs and their wishes. You need to understand what their story says about them, what their care plan says about them, what do they like. And the reason that we do this is to give people that sense of belonging, so they feel like they are being respected as an individual rather than just treated exactly the same as everybody else. So on that last principle and value, I said it was to avoid institutional abuse. And on this one, you can see it again. If we didn't take into account a child or an adult or a teenager's, whoever it is, their likes, their dislikes, their needs and their wishes, then we would be giving them potentially institutional abuse if everything we did they hated. It wouldn't be fair. And that's where equality and inclusion come into this. So if you can go to that box there, principle and value 3, taking into account wishes, needs, likes, dislikes on page 53, I'll help you to structure that question. So if we can start it with equality and inclusion form the basis for the principle and value of taking into account wishes, needs, likes and dislikes because we need to think about people's preferences. Children have favourite toys. You can give me some more examples of their favourites, their preferences there. Children will also have different needs to each other, such as, and then give me some examples, and then I want you to say something like regardless of differences they could have. Okay, so you can pause this video here and you can answer that question for me. Okay, so the final principle and value that we're looking at there is respecting and valuing differences. Now, respecting and valuing differences, I feel like I've touched on it a couple of times already, because by looking at people's individual care plans, by looking at their life stories, by taking into account their wishes and their needs and what they like and what they don't like, we're already respecting who they are as a person, because we're not going to force everybody to eat, I don't know, toast with no butter every day for breakfast and tea with no milk, because that would be institutional abuse. So when you're thinking about how equality and inclusion underpin this principle and value, I want you to think about it in terms of training. Now, when you work in health and social care, when you work in childcare, when you work in education settings, you are expected to keep up to date with your equality training. So every year I have to do a training course in equality and diversity, and that shows that my knowledge is current, because things do change. And we also sometimes need reminding of things that we perhaps don't do every day. So it is like a government focus as well. So we can start that answer off with sort of that training part. So if we start it with equality and inclusion form the basis for the respecting and valuing difference principle, because, and then if you can say, because all staff are required to undertake training every 12 months, which helps them to respect differences and value people for who they are. Okay, and then you can pause this video, and that should be the end of page 53. Okay, so the next question is a poster. So the next question is on page 55. So it says you're going to create a large poster, okay? What you can do is you can use the paper at the back of that sheet, and obviously on page 55 you've still got a bit of paper on there as well that's not been taken up, so you can use these as well if you've not got any paper at home there. Okay, so it says you are going to create a large poster containing all of Learning Outcome 2. This means you need to be careful not to overcrowd the information so that you can fit it all on. So this is going to be a challenge, isn't it? Not making sure that you're not putting too much information on there that you run out of space. Now, you can go on to extra pieces of paper here, that's absolutely fine. So it says identify at least 4 discriminatory attitudes. For each attitude, give an example of how it can affect those individuals. Identify at least 4 discriminatory behaviours. For each behaviour, you need to give examples of how discriminatory behaviours can affect individuals. So what we're looking at doing, first of all, is A. So identify at least 4 discriminatory attitudes. Okay. So when we're thinking about discrimination, we are thinking about the opposite of what we just looked at. So we're thinking about the opposite of inclusion, the opposite of equality, the opposite of valuing differences and respecting people. Okay. So we've got some examples on the PowerPoint here. I'm going to try and show. Three attitudes for your first one on A. So staff could have discriminatory attitudes such as assuming a service user cannot do something because of their disability and doing it for them. When I worked in care, this is something I saw most common because people say, oh, it's quicker if I just do it for you. But by doing that, you're taking away somebody's independence. Likewise, you could do this with children. You could easily say, oh, let me just wipe your bottom because I'll be quicker and we need to get going now. Let me tie your shoelaces. I'll get it done quicker than you can. And before you realise it, you are putting that person down for something that they actually can do, but you're not allowing them to do. Not respecting service users. So that could be a whole wide range of things, couldn't it? Not allowing service users to have their rights, such as confidentiality. So if you're going home and talking to your partner, your children, your parents, all about patient A and child B and service user C, then you're not being fair to them because you're not allowing them to have their rights, because you're telling everybody about them. Oh, you should have seen her at on the weekdays. She did this the other day. She did that the other day. And, you're mocking that person. It's not fair. Of course, it doesn't have to be mocking either for confidentiality to be broken. It could be something just like, telling somebody their full name. That's breach of confidentiality. Not allowing service users to have a voice in their care. So we looked before about needs and wishes. Allowing them to have those choices in place is going to make them feel so much brighter about themselves because they're able to feel they have a sense of belonging. Not allowing service users to complain about the service they receive. So at the very start of your programme, I got you to sign the sheet at the front of your file with your complaints procedure in. Had I not have given you that complaints procedure, I'm not giving you your rights to complain, which is unfair on you. So it's so important that you have the right to complain without having to approach the person that perhaps you wish to complain about. Not allowing service users time to complete tasks. So if they have a visual impairment, it may take them longer to find their outfit of choice. So that example there is more to do with health and social care settings, perhaps working with adults. However, you could have a child with a visual impairment in a nursery who may take longer to find a toy that they particularly like. And if you don't give them the time to find that toy, then they're going to get frustrated with you, and you're probably going to get frustrated with them, not realising that they're frustrated with you for that discriminatory reason. So when we're thinking about how these people may feel, you can see these in yellow. So, feeling that they have no purpose, feeling they have no confidence, feeling frustrated, feeling disempowered, feeling angry, feeling frustrated, what I'd like you to do is to choose 4 of those. You can obviously come up with your own examples as well if you wish to. But what I'd like you to do is to, really show those behaviours. How would it make you feel? How would it make your child feel? So make sure you do write them in sentences, a bit more than I have here. But you can pause this page now and you can write 4 of those out or think of your own 4 examples. So the next question is C, and it says identify 4 discriminatory behaviours. So we have some on the slide here as well. So being ignored, I said on the communication unit yesterday, I think that's my worst fear, just being ignored. I don't like being ignored. I like to be sociable. So if someone did that to me, I'd certainly feel discriminated against, especially if everybody else is being spoken to. Preparing activities that some service users cannot take part in. So you could think of this as children as well. If you've got a child using a wheelchair but you've got a sports day where they're doing an assault course, that child cannot necessarily join in, and that's not fair. You're indirectly discriminating that child by not allowing them to partake in that activity. If you want to think about it in terms of adults, you could say, maybe there's an activity at a table, but there's not enough room for a wheelchair to fit in that table because it's too high or it's too low. Not allowing some service users to participate. So again, we can relate this back to children. If we think about it in terms of children, not allowing some children to participate, asking them to go, perhaps to the back of the room and face the wall, how's that child going to feel? Keeping some service users separated from others in different areas of the home, of the nursery, of the school. So if you've got a child who has a behavioural issue, perhaps it is right to remove them from the classroom or from the main nursery setting for an hour or so at a time, perhaps less, perhaps more. But it's so important that they are learning how to socially adapt to these situations by having inclusion in place. Offensive language, so if you're swearing at somebody, whether it's a parent, whether it's a child, an adult you're caring for, it's just not appropriate. The next one about inappropriate language, jargon here. So jargon literally means like a sort of a word that you might use in work, but it doesn't really make much sense outside of it. So it's just not accessible by people. And the last one there, not addressing somebody by their chosen name. So you could have a child called Jonathan, but he's always been called Johnny. It's so important that if his name is Johnny, then call him Johnny. Don't call him Jonathan. He probably won't answer. So again, for the last section for D, you have some feelings to explore. So again, you don't have to just copy mine. You can have a think about your own feelings there. How might these children feel? How might the parents feel? So we've got some behaviours here like depressed, withdrawn, like they don't fit in, upset, low confidence, scared, angry, aggressive, unable to communicate with staff if they're not understanding what is going on, frustrated. So I'm going to just leave that there for a moment so you can pause this, and I want you to finish those C and D on there as well. If you're struggling to fit it all on one sheet, you can put it onto 2, of course, that's absolutely fine. So pause now. Okay, so the next question on page 57 says, you need to identify 4 social barriers and 4 physical barriers that can prevent equality and inclusion and outline how these can be overcome. Okay, so you'll see on your page that 4 social barriers is highlighted in blue and 4 physical barriers is highlighted in yellow. So if we just skip forward a couple of pages, you will see that you've got some blue pages and some yellow pages. Now what I've just remembered is that it should be 3 social barriers and 4 physical. That's why there's only 3 blue pages. Okay, so if you're wondering why there's only 3 blue pages, that is why. So you can just cross out there 4 social barriers and change it to a 3. Okay, so a social barrier that may prevent equality and inclusion, and then we're going to outline how that may be overcome. So remember, when we're identifying, we can write it just in a short sentence, and when we are outlining, it needs to be written as a full sentence, okay? Because we're doing 3 pages for the social barriers, don't worry about outlining it with 3 sentences per box. You can have your 3 sentences across 3 pages, so 1 per box will be enough. Okay, so social barriers, I've got a few for you here. A service user not being able to communicate with staff. So you can write that in social barrier 1. A service user not being able to communicate with staff. For social barrier 2 on page 58, you can write criticising service users for not being able to do things. Criticising service users for not being able to do things. And for social barrier 3 on page 59, you can write negative attitudes of staff. Not seeing people before their disabilities. Negative attitudes of staff and not seeing people before their disabilities. Okay, so let's go back to page 57 and we're going to outline now what that first one is. So a service user is unable to communicate with staff. How can we overcome that barrier? How could we help that service user to communicate? So when you completed Unit 4, we had a look at communication methods, and we said it's always so important to use that person's preferred method of communication. Make sure staff are trained in using that method of communication. So the reason for that is because if it is, say, Makaton or British Sign Language or French or German or whatever, it's so important that we have a staff member who understands that communication method and can communicate with that service user, because otherwise it's not worth knowing their preferred communication method. So what I'd like you to do is to write something along those lines down. So make sure you do it in a sentence, but we need to find out a person's preferred method of communication and make sure staff are trained in using it. Okay, just pause that for a minute. So on to page 58, we have got criticising service users for not being able to do things written in there. So how can we overcome this barrier? Okay, so if we've got service users being criticised for not being able to do things, are those people in the appropriate job? Probably not. So I think, so if staff are criticising service users, what would you do in that situation if you've got a little boy or a little girl being criticised in the nursery for not being potty trained because they're older, or not being able to hop, skip and jump because they, for whatever reason, haven't learnt that yet, or they're a bit afraid to do so, and that staff member is criticising them? What do you think you'd do with that information? Would you keep it to yourself? Would you say something? Or would you report it on? So of course you'd have to report it on. You'd have to make sure that that child's needs are being met, that they are being treated equally and fairly. And to do that, you would have to make a complaint to your senior, to your manager, to make sure that that is dealt with, because currently it's not fair on the child to be criticised or the service user to be criticised in care. So if you can write that into a sentence for me. So staff need to report the criticising of a child or a service user to the manager so it can be dealt with. Okay, so if you pause that for a moment, you'll be able to move on to the next one in just a sec. And question 59, we had on there negative attitudes of staff not seeing a person before their disability. So this is really important. When we are working with people with a disability, children, adults, teenagers, whoever it is so important that we see people before their disability. Okay, so if all we do is just categorize that person into he is disabled, she is disabled, we're automatically sort of saying they can't. We're being very negative. And it's often not the case. So I spoke a little bit yesterday about my friend who uses a wheelchair. And when I sent her that clip from yesterday on the Unit 4 communication, she said, make sure you tell them that I do have a very good brain as well. I'm very clever. So there you go. And it is so important that we do see that person before their disability, because we can't make a judgment on who that person is just because of maybe something we've seen on TV. So in order to overcome that, so in order to reduce that barrier and help that barrier to be overcome, we need to make sure that staff are trained in equality and diversity, because this is what your training does. It enables you to see the person before their disability and to ask questions and to find out as much as you can about that person. So even something like reading the care plan, finding out about that child, finding out about that adult, whoever it is that you're caring for. So when you're structuring that answer, you can say staff should be trained to help to overcome this barrier, as it will help them to understand that people have, because it will help them to understand that disabilities are different for everybody. Okay, so if you just pause that there for a moment, that should finish page 59. So once you've got that done, you can resume. Okay, so we should now be on page 60. So we should be on to our first physical barrier. So when we're thinking about physical barriers are something that's physically there that is stopping somebody from accessing perhaps a service, perhaps something that helps them to stay included. So we'll go through a few of these. So on your first one, if you can write inappropriate transport, not being able to access buses or taxis. Okay, so physical barrier 1 on page 60, inappropriate transport, not being able to access buses or taxis. If you then go on to page 61, we'll have a look at another there. So for physical barrier 2, can you write broken lifts? So broken lift, not being able to access part of a building. On page 62, if you could write no ramps available and not being able to use the stairs. No ramps available and not being able to use the stairs. And for number 4 on page 63, if you could write no facilities for Braille. No facilities for Braille. So Braille is spelt B-R-A-I-L-L-E. B-R-A-I-L-L-E. Okay, so let's go back to page 60. Okay, so physical barrier 1. So physical barrier 1, we said inappropriate transport, so not being able to get on a bus or in a taxi. Okay. So to be able to help somebody to get onto a bus or into a taxi, it's so important that somebody doesn't have this barrier in life, because whether you're a child, whether you're a teenager, whether you're a young adult, an older adult, we all need to go out and about somewhere. And I think at this moment in time, we're feeling what it's like to actually not be able to go out and about anywhere because we're being told to socially distance ourselves and isolate ourselves. So in order to make sure that a person or a child can get out and about, we need to make sure a risk assessment is completed. So using a sentence, you're going to write in there, in that second box after physical barrier 1 on page 60, a risk assessment needs to be completed so we know which transport can be accessed. Okay, so you can pause that there if you're still writing. We're going to go on to page 61. So for 61, we said broken lifts. So if a lift is broken, that is going to prevent somebody from being able to access parts of the building. So if we think back to the church that we were working in, we were teaching on floor 1. If that lift was broken and somebody used a wheelchair or a scooter or something, they wouldn't be able to access that room. So what would I have to do? I would have to inform my manager, I would have to change rooms or ultimately change venues. It wouldn't be right of me to say, you have to go home today because you cannot come in. It could be okay to do that if it was for a one-off, but it's absolutely not fair because that person is being excluded for something that is not anything to do with themselves. It's the physical barrier that is stopping them from coming in. So when you're thinking about writing your answer, you can say about maintaining those lifts, so getting them serviced, changing rooms, changing venues. Okay, so that's the end of 61, so you can write your sentence there, and we'll move on to 62. So for 62, you had no ramps. No ramps. So if there are no ramps available and somebody is not able to use the stairs, this doesn't have to be a wheelchair. This could be somebody who cannot use the stairs because they get very breathless. They may have a heart problem, they could have a lung problem, and they're not able to use stairs because it is exhausting for them. So we need to make sure that this barrier is overcome so that people can get out and about still. So because the stairs are there, what do you think we could do? So there's a few options as to what we could do. So we could use portable ramps. So if you think about buses and trains, they have portable ramps. On the buses, it's sort of built into the bus, it's very high tech. On the trains, they have an actual ramp that they get out and they sort of tighten it up to the side door of the train, so they can get their trolley off, and then they can also allow people using wheelchairs to get on. But it has to be booked, and that's a bit of a pickle, isn't it? Also, if we think about, say, the church, at the front of the church there were about 4 or 5 steps to get up. They have one of those little lifts next to it, which is great. If that lift wasn't working, they'd need a ramp. But it's no good just purchasing a ramp and assuming that somebody will be able to use it without hurting themselves or hurting the person using it. So you need to purchase the ramp, but you also need to train your staff in how to use it safely so that it is effective. So that's how you can sort of start your answer there. So in sentences, I want you to write about, getting a ramp for the stairs and training the staff in how to use that ramp, making sure it is safe for themselves and those service users, those children. Okay, so pause me now if you're still on 62. For 63, we had down no facilities for Braille. Okay, so Braille, we talked about this in Unit 4 for communication. So it's those little raised dots that are on paracetamol and ibuprofen tablets, was my example yesterday, where people who have a visual impairment or are blind are often trained in how to use Braille. You'll also find Braille in lifts, so that because they can't sort of feel the number, they can feel for the dots, which obviously tell them the number in a different format to what we use. So if there are no facilities for Braille, what we need to do is try and get some translation done, because like I said yesterday, I wouldn't be able to translate something into Braille. I don't have a Braille printer, I don't have Braille knowledge. So it's so important that we try and get in touch with a charity who would have access to that. So if you're working in the nursery, you've got a child who comes in and they do have a visual impairment, or maybe they are, fully blind or registered blind, then you need to make sure that you have those facilities in place if that's something that's going to help them in later life to be able to learn to read using Braille. You need to get in touch with a charity who can help you and support you as staff members and as a team to use that, and they can also help with training and documentation and printing, and they'll even support them to try and read it. So charity help is key there. So when you're answering that question on page 63, you can say, get support from a charity that works with Braille. They can help with staff training, they can help with documentation, they can help with printing, and they can help the child or the service user learn to use it. Okay, so that's the end of my chat for page 63, so you can pause me now. So we've got one last question left to do on page 64. This is a little bit longer than the one we did the other day on YouTube, but I think it's gone quite well. I hope you agree. So for question 31 on page 64, if you can have a look at that one for me. It says, outline at least 4 behaviours that may promote equality and inclusion. Okay, so when we're thinking about promoting equality and inclusion, we're thinking about what equality means. So equality meaning fair opportunities, no discrimination, and inclusion meaning that everybody is able to access and feel included and have that sense of belonging in a group setting. So if we think about that group setting as a nursery, what we want to be able to do is to include all children in the activities. We want to make sure that we are using methods of communication that the children understand. We want to make sure that we are getting approval from the family members or the carers as to what is right for that child, because we need to know about their needs and their wishes. So getting that life story is a way to promote equality and inclusion. We need to make sure we are giving eye contact. It sounds like a basic one, this, but giving eye contact to everybody in the room. So if you are singling out one child when you are, say, reading a story at story time, if you're not making eye contact with one of those children, they might feel excluded from that story. They might feel that you're being very negative and discriminatory to them. Although they may not be able to say those things, they could feel it in terms of their self-esteem. We need to make sure we're offering choices, because that's the promotion of independence. By offering choices, it could be, what would you like for pudding? Would you like chocolate cake or a piece of fruit? If there's that choice that they've got to make available, then it's promoting their independence. It's giving them a voice, which is what we talked about, isn't it? Okay, so I've talked through quite a few of these, but I'll just put these on your screen here as well. So what I'd like you to do is to have a read of that, so you can pause it on here and you can outline 4 of these, okay? So in a sentence, you can just summarise 4 of these as a minimum to finish that question, okay? So that is the end. So that is the end of Unit 5. So in Unit 5, we looked at some learning outcomes. The outcomes were to understand and gain awareness of equality and inclusion, to define the terms of equality and inclusion, to identify discriminatory behaviours, to explain what to do if we suspect a discriminatory behaviour, and to outline how barriers can be overcome regarding equality and inclusion. So once you've got to the end of that and you've finished question 31 on page 64, that's this unit finished. Thanks for watching.